So I'll just start right off. How strong do you think emerging markets are right now? And what will happen if the Federal Reserve keeps hiking rates?
Well, I think the Federal Reserve is unlikely to keep hiking rates. One reason being that emerging markets don't seem to be very strong right now. But the question, I think, is interesting. So you've started, your very first question is to ask me to make an economic forecast. And in fact, I think that we economists are generally terrible at forecasts because everyone's terrible at forecasts. We can't see into the future, no one can see into the future. So I think it's really interesting that people have come to expect this in a way that they don't, for example, expect a doctor to tell them when they're going to die, or indeed what they're going to die of. They instead expect that a doctor will be able to diagnose if there are any problems and prescribe some solutions. So I would like to get people out of the habit of asking economists to foretell the future, and I think we economists should get out of the habit of answering questions about the future.
Why do people commission and rely so much on forecasts and prediction of the future if they do tend to be wrong so much of the time?
I think one reason is that forecasts are just a great way of attracting attention. I've been talking this evening at UCL about statistical bullshit, and I think that forecasts are a form of statistical bullshit. They don't really convey a great deal of information, but they're interesting, they're eye-catching, they're like a peacock's feathers. They look nice. And so a lot of investment banks will commission a chief economist, for example, to make forecasts about what's going to happen to the Eurozone or whatever, and the chief economist will be able to say these things on the television, and then the investment bank gets its name on television. So that's one of the things that's going on. You might ask, why does anybody want to have an investment bank chief economist on television making forecasts? I think it's partly because the world is a very complicated place. And the moment you start saying, well, what's really happening in China right now? Well, you start talking about, okay, the commodity prices and the exports. Are we talking about exports measured by volume or exports measured by value? Because that turns out to be different. And do we believe the GDP statistics? Well, we don't really totally believe it. Well, how much do we not believe the GDP statistics? And what statistics can we rely on? And on and on and on and on and on. And really hard. Whereas if you just confidently say, oh, I think China's going to enter a severe recession, then we feel that we've learned something about the world. Haven't necessarily, but we get that sense, and then we feel calm. We feel uncertainty has been resolved. So the forecast's terribly appealing. I feel this even myself. So the worst possible forecasts are forecasts about stock markets. And we think, in theory, stock markets cannot be forecast, right? So why do we ask any economist to forecast them? I believe that stock markets basically can't be forecast. And yet when I hear somebody giving me a stock market forecast, I'm like, ooh, that's interesting. And I'm hooked. The idea of the forecast is ridiculous, but the reality of the forecast is very engaging. So I think they're kind of a bit like Pringles. So we snack on them, they're a bit addictive. We know they're not really doing us any good, but we can't help ourselves.
Sure. Okay. I'll move towards finance a little bit. Do you think that the post-2008 bank regulation has been effective, and do you think banks are regulated enough?
I think it's been moderately effective, and I don't think that regulated enough is the right question, actually. So the question is, how are they being regulated? What is being regulated? What is being monitored? So one of the problems before the crisis was not so much that banks weren't being regulated, it's just that the regulations weren't working and weren't the right kinds of regulations. For example, just to pick a particular example, the Basel Capital Accords. So this is an international agreement about how much banks are allowed to borrow to fund their investments versus how much they need to raise money from shareholders. And if you raise money from shareholders, that's safer because you never really have to pay it back. So in a crisis, you don't have to pay back your shareholders on any particular date, whereas if you borrow money, you've got to pay it back at a particular date, otherwise you're bankrupt. So naturally, the term is leverage, how much leverage do banks have, becomes very interesting to regulators. So we had this huge series of international agreements that got bigger and bigger and bigger. And before the crisis, we had literally millions of different gradations of risk feeding into the calculation about how much leverage banks should have. Okay, well, it didn't really work, you might have noticed. Then after the crisis, Andy Haldane, who's now the chief economist of the Bank of England, went through the data on, or the sort of risk-weighted leverage measure. And he found that actually, if a bank looked really bad on the risk-weighted leverage measure, or really good on the risk-weighted leverage measure, didn't tell you very much about whether that bank actually needed a bailout or went bankrupt during the crisis. So this measure that was developed with tremendous sophistication was kind of meaningless. If, on the other hand, you went to a really simple measure of leverage with none of these millions of gradations of risk and just said, has the bank borrowed a lot of money? I'm not going to ask what the bank's doing. I'm not going to ask where the bank is, who it's lending to, anything. I just want to know, did the bank borrow a lot of money? It turns out that one question gives you more information than all of these capital accords. So it's not just about, is regulation tough enough, it's is regulation smart enough? And that's really, really tough. It's a genuinely difficult problem. I think regulation has improved in some ways. I think it's got more conservative. I think that's appropriate. But I think in other ways it's making the same old mistakes of lots and lots of complexity. And when you're complex, you can be tough, but if you're complex, no one really understands what's going on. And that's the problem.
All right. To continue on that train of thought, do you think it's possible or even likely for a next financial crisis to occur in the next few years?
Of course it's possible. Anything's possible. We could be hit by a meteorite tomorrow and no one will ever get to see the video of this interview, which would be a shame. Is it likely? I don't know. I really don't know. I didn't see the last financial crisis coming. Why would I have any great insight into the next one? All I would say is that I think it's likely that if there is a second financial crisis, it's going to be different to the last one because they tend to come back in different forms. People will be watching out for the last one, so something new will happen. The other thing is I would say, if there's a next financial crisis soon, like within the next 3 or 4 years, I would actually say it's not really a next financial crisis, it's just a long, drawn-out part of the previous one. Remember that the Great Depression lasted the best part of a decade, and the Wall Street crash actually, which wiped 89% of the value of shares, the Wall Street crash lasted nearly 4 years. Just the process of shares falling took nearly 4 years. We look back and we think of it as kind of one day Wall Street just fell, but it was years and years and years. So I'm not so very confident that we're completely clear of the last crisis before we start looking out for the next one.
Fair enough. To move on to a slightly different topic, what do you think is the main cause of growing income inequality in the West? And do you think inequality can be or is a good thing?
I don't think inequality is a good thing. I think it can be the byproduct of good things, but I don't think it's a good thing in itself. I've never quite understood that argument. However, I think trying to achieve perfect equality, I can't even imagine how an economy would work with perfect equality. Market mechanisms, the experimentation, the trial and error, the freedom of market mechanisms do so much good, and inevitably they also produce some inequality, which I think is not good. So it's all bound up together. Clearly there are things we can do about it, and the most obvious thing is redistributive taxation. And we do quite a lot of that already, often not commented upon. We do quite a lot of redistributive taxation. But the other thing to really look out for is just to make the economic system work better. So when you look at how a lot of really rich people got their money, it's often because they had a big intellectual property monopoly or they were given some other monopoly. There was some way in which the rules favoured them. Sometimes in a really grotesquely corrupt way. Other times, so Bill Gates, I don't think Bill Gates is the beneficiary of corruption. Bill Gates is the beneficiary of, we just wrote these laws that said, if you create this incredibly valuable intellectual property, you get to keep an awful lot of it, rather than letting the intellectual property expire after a while. So that's not corrupt, but we could have different rules, and the different rules might work better. When we look at the causes of the rise in inequality, I think there are a lot of different things going on. I think one thing is globalization. I think 15 years ago we didn't think that globalization was having a big effect on inequality and in-country inequality, but I think it probably is. I think now you've got poorer workers in richer countries competing with richer workers in poorer countries. And that's why global inequality is falling, but inequality in a lot of countries is rising. Technology is changing things, and perhaps the political system has become more tolerant of inequality. One other thing, people talk a lot about inequality between the rich and the poor, but in the UK in the last 6 or 7 years, that's not really changed. If anything, it's fallen a bit. But what has changed dramatically has been inequality between the old and the young. The young have really suffered. The old have been really cushioned from the impact of the financial crisis. And I'm not sure quite why that doesn't get a little bit more attention. So there's all kinds of inequality to consider: gender inequality, racial inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality. We can't just look at any one indicator, because no one indicator tells us everything that's going on.
Fair enough. What do you think would be the economic consequences of a Brexit on Britain and the EU?
I think a lot depends on the terms under which Brexit was negotiated, and that's really hard to say what those terms would be, because no one seems very willing to discuss them. What I would hope is that if the UK does leave the European Union, not that much would change. It wouldn't do that much damage, that we'd still have access to the EU trade areas. Probably we'd actually have to accept most EU regulations just for the pure commercial convenience. There's no point in trading with someone if all your food safety standards are different and your pollution standards are different and all of that. So I would hope that not a great deal would change. On the other hand, if the best case scenario is not much changes, then I think one has to wonder what the benefit of leaving would be. I haven't seen anybody set out a really convincing case that there would be a dramatic change for the better, but maybe there would be. So we'll have to see. The debate's still fairly new.
All right. Now for our final signature question, which is which came first, the chicken or the egg?
It reminds me of a New Yorker cartoon with the chicken and the egg in bed together, and the chicken is smoking and the egg's looking annoyed, and says, "Well, I think we settled that question."
All right, I think that's brilliant. Yeah, that's all we have time for.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Yeah. Thank you.